Good morning, guys. Kyle, Hendo, thanks for
Hi.
joining us today. I
Morning.
think it's
How you doing?
appropriate that I say good morning to both of you, even though Hendo, I know you're in Australia right now and it's 2 a.m. your time, but it is technically morning, so I'm glad to share the morning with you both and everybody watching today. I think this is the first one of these we actually, had a pretty good representation from around the world. Kyle, you're Canadian.
Yep.
Hendo, you're Australian. So this is a fun angle that I think just shows, how big our group is and how much community comes together in craft beer. So I'm really looking forward to listening to you both today. And I mentioned it both to you individually when you approached me about doing one of these panel conversations. I know both of you, are so much into the technical side of craft beer. I was a little nervous about where the conversation would go, but then you shot me the proposed title, which I just want to read for a second. I think it's a ton of fun. It's rapid product development. How to make consistent beers that keep consumers engaged. And Hendo, I know you love those long titles, but I think this is a really important, fun topic that we can dive in today because craft beer is literally all about just continuing to put out good beers and engaging with your audience. But before we get too much into that, Kyle, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and why you are here today?
All right. So I'm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I'm an engineer with a brewing problem. I've been in the craft beer industry for almost a decade now, which seems scary, but I help a lot with engineering type projects in craft breweries because people need to keep their equipment running, just like your car needs a mechanic. And there's very few of those skill sets. So what I do is I help out people source stainless steel, and then I do offer coaching services in terms of like product development and process control. Because if you can get the process down pat, you're going to be making a lot more consistent beer consistently.
Yeah, the two definitely go hand in hand. Now, Hendo, about yourself, tell us a little about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm my business is called Rockstar Brewer. I run a private online community of like-minded brewers, and we help each other with brewing beer quality, process, little bit of safety we're going to dabble into in the new year and that sort of thing. And we just enjoy learning together.
And once again, we appreciate you for staying awake for us. You were just talking about how you teach at a local university and you took the students to the pub for a field trip recently. And I'm
That's
kind of
right. Yeah,
jealous
that
that you
was,
get to,
yeah.
it's
Yeah. A
nice you
couple
get
of beers in
to
the
do that
pub,
out
go to bed early, get up at 2 o'clock, do a thing, probably go back to bed.
Well,
I'm set.
thank you again for being here. Now let's kind of dive in. But before we, really get into the topic, I guess backstage a minute ago, Kyle, you were just mentioning how you hate it when a brewery posts on their social media just asking for what should we brew next. What about that makes you cringe, and why do you believe that's not the right approach?
Well, it's just you should always be kind of giving confidence to your consumers that you know what you're doing and what you know what you're talking about. And I remember at one point, one of my customers, what they did is they did that with a. They're like, "What should we call our next beers?" And I immediately called them or messaged them, and I was like, "Please take this down. This is not the message you want to send to your customers." And they're like, "Why not?" And it's like, because it's basically saying you're out of ideas. And I don't like that because it's like you have talented marketing people, you have talented brewing people. They probably have lots of ideas. Maybe the idea hasn't come to the table yet quite yet, but it's not like there's a lack of creativity in your organization, and you should always give your customers that impression that you have lots of ideas coming. Ultimately, what they did is they quite literally just got a whole bunch of post-it notes and then put treats on top of like the ideas, and then they recorded which ones their dog ate the treats off of the post-it notes. And I'm like, this is infinitely better than just simply asking like the general public on what the beer name should be. Because and the other thing is, if someone's idea doesn't get picked, they might feel a little bit bitter too. So if you don't want to drive away customers by saying, oh, we don't like your ideas, because well, that's not a good relationship building exercise for anyone. So keep things to your brewing and marketing staff, because you're paying them a lot of money to do those jobs. So why are you crowdsourcing them?
With
Yeah, I
regard to
would
that
agree.
dog idea, did they actually put it on the internet? Did they live stream it of sorts? Because I feel like that'd be a quality,
Uh,
video.
no, I don't think they did live stream it, but um, it just like there's plenty of like beer names, and beer marketing is one of those things that a lot of people just don't think about originally, but if you just even put like a whiteboard or a bunch of post-it notes on a cork board or something, and while you're doing things, just any idea that comes into your head, just put it on that board. It fills up pretty quick, and then you can work through everything and just wean it down to figure out what connects best with your branding message and what connects best with your customer base.
So from you two's perspective, which comes first, the marketing or the beer?
The beer.
I think you should have both, and I think they need to run in parallel. Because I used to run a gypsy brewing company called Brew. That's that one just up there, and it was a brewing company that was entirely based around seasonal beers. We didn't really have a core range for the first sort of 2 years of its lifespan, and so I kept a list. I use Evernote, and I had a list of a bunch of cool names or label ideas or something like that, and then I had another note with beer ideas, and I would just, if something popped into my mind, I would just add to either of those lists, usually after a couple of beers and that sort of thing. That's how I sort of built up kind of like the initial, that sort of planted the seed of a beer idea.
No, I love it. Thanks for sharing that. Do you still do the gypsy brewing, or how long ago was that?
No, God, no. No, that finished up in 2017 and ended pretty poorly. That's why I do what I do now, to try and sort of help brewers not go down the same path that I went, but keep brewing fun and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely important to keep brewing fun. I mean, that's why we all got into this industry, because we love craft beer, whether it's the marketing side, the brewing side. There's something about craft beer and the creativity that just jumped out to us. In the current state of craft beer right now, it's just so important to keep our customers engaged. And, as someone who works at a brewery, whatever your position may be, you got to keep that inspiration flowing. It's super important, whether you're doing that through, putting out unique one-offs or just messing with your seasonal line. What are some of the ways you guys have seen engagement with the community, best in action to keeping your lineup fresh?
I would say some of the best ways that I've seen.
Sure.
I'm a big. I don't know if you guys get it over in get it over in Canada and the US, but I'm a pretty reasonable Garage Project fan. They're based out of Wellington in New Zealand, and they have been since the very first, or their first year before they even produced beer commercially. They were very prolific in coming up with new beer ideas, and I think they did this thing whilst they had a little 50-litre Sabco system. I'm just recalling this as best as I can. And I think they did a new beer every week for 52 weeks, and that was a brand building exercise for them whilst they put the whole Garage Project concept and brewery together and that sort of thing. And even today, I'm still a big fan of Garage Project. They do amazing beers with amazing labels, and the beers are of such high quality. It's very... I can't even recall if I've ever had a Garage Project release that's been not so great. Everyone's got an opinion and that sort of thing. But they are still innovating and innovating hard. And they do have a very small, core range, but they just keep going and going and going. There's always new beers coming out, and I think now they have such breadth in their beer releases. So they do hazies and usual clean beers, and then they've got their sour beer project in another building where they do some amazing stuff. Cool Ship, all these different. He's got these terracotta things that I asked Josh from Garage Project. I said, do you worry those things are going to fall over? They look really expensive, and they had beer in these big terracotta pots. Anyway, so the whole thing is just awesome. So, hey, I got an idea. Let's ask the chat to tell us the names of some of the breweries that they think are really innovative. So just type that into the comments or the chat, punch in some names, we'd be curious to hear, and we'll keep talking.
Now, Hendo, with regard to them putting out a beer every week, a new beer every week, how were they creating these ideas? Was the brewer just working overtime to just innovate, or were they taking ideas from other people in the brewery?
I can't really speak for Garage Project and how they sort of came up with beer ideas, but I think that some of the challenges that a brewery can face when it comes to keeping innovative and keeping fresh new beer ideas going out into the market is brewers can get really caught up in the day-to-day of production. They might have very significant demands on their product, and they can't really maybe spare the production capacity, or they're working so hard that they forget to do some pilot brewing or doing some innovation and that sort of thing. And that can lead to like a few problems, because if you're not innovating and if you're not constantly tweaking your beer lineup, and it's not just about seasonal beer releases or one-offs, it's about your core range as well. And you've got to constantly take a look at all of the beers in your brewery's lineup. And if one of them's if one or two or a couple of them are underperforming, then you've got to make the hard decisions to say, right, well, that's got to go because that just doesn't sell that well, and we need to focus on something new. And so it can be very difficult for a brewery to be adaptable in terms of their lineup, and there are a number of different reasons for that. But I think if you give yourself permission to be creative, to experiment, to pilot brew a lot is one way to get around that, and I'm sure we'll talk about that shortly. And to reinvigorate your consumers, then that keeps them attached to your brand, and it shows a sense of leadership. Because I know Kyle was saying before, is like, posting on social media, asking them what the brewery should brew next, or what name should our beer be. And I think that does the consumer a disservice, because they're drinking the beer because they want to relax, on a Friday afternoon or a Saturday or something like that. They don't want to have to think about what's going to happen next, right? They look to the brewery to tell them, to say, hey, show us a little bit of leadership, to say, hey, this is what we're doing. This is the cool thing. And if you're sitting there on a Friday afternoon after a massive week of work and that sort of thing, you're like, shit, yeah, I want to try that. That's kind of the leadership that a brewery needs to show.
Now, I want to kind of focus on, the flagship beers for a second now. We've seen a lot of conversation about the value of flagships over the past couple of years. And, through COVID, the whole experience has been, a lot of people have been drinking things they're more comfortable with. So I imagine a lot of the flagships, we've seen an uptick in their sales. But with regard to the innovation aspects of this, while it is kind of like an emotional challenge to maybe get rid of a flagship that isn't selling well, what are you guys' thoughts on maybe rebranding that flagship, putting new marketing behind it, and seeing if we see an uptick there just by giving it a fresher look? What are your thoughts on that?
I actually know this experience really well. I was the head brewer at Cameron's in 4 years in Ontario. And as I was leaving, so their package format for all their flagships was a 6-pack of 12-ounce bottles in a closed carton. And the branding hadn't really been updated from the 90s. And in Ontario at the time, the LCBO, which is the purchaser of alcohol, basically said, no, if you're craft beer, we want you in single can, tall cans. So the sales were going down and going down and going down, because no one was willing to buy craft beer in 6-packs at the time. It was actually kind of ironic, because it was originally sold in 9-packs, and it was a logistical nightmare in terms of sourcing cardboard and shipping, but consumers liked it because through a legal loophole, it was the largest single amount of beer you could buy from the LCBO, because it was 9 bottles. They weren't allowed to sell 12-packs, but they could sell 6-packs, and then no one wrote a law on 9-packs, because why? So they switched to 6-packs. Sales went actually down because it was a unique product, and then they eventually switched to they did a full rebrand. They put it into tall cans, and that completely changed their sales performance. And it was the same beer, but they went from generic product names like lager, cream ale, amber ale, to giving those brands identities, and then they couldn't really keep up anymore. So that was like an uphill struggle to change the notions of this company that had been doing things the same way for 20 years. But changing the format, or if, for example, if you have a product that isn't like that is a flagship that isn't doing exceptionally well, you could shift it into a seasonal rotation, and you don't have to deep six it completely, but you can shift it in your portfolio, because your consumers are still going to want that product, even if they're not 20% of your sales. There's going to be a couple of people that are really upset that you get rid of products. So if you shift it or rebrand it or change the package, you might get a little bit better traction, and then you're not completely getting rid of a flagship product.
That's right. A bit of FOMO always helps sales sometimes.
What are your thoughts, though, on, say, those flagship beers that aren't selling too well, as in make it more of a limited release and doing it yearly? Do you believe some breweries can experience success with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you can do is, so a lot of breweries here in Australia, they might use I don't know how many ounces this is. I'm just going to talk metric because that's what we do down here. 375 ml can, and then they'll do their seasonal releases in a 500 ml can. And there's a lot to be said about taking a slow-moving core range or flagship beer, taking it out of that small packaging, putting it into larger packaging, knowing that people are going to buy singles and not 4-packs or 6-packs and that sort of thing. And the margins can go up if you make that format change, So, and if you take that beer off the market occasionally and then bring it back occasionally. And just sometimes that's just where a beer needs to be. So, you certainly have to be open to experimentation in that sense.
Now, going on to experimentation and kind of taking it back to the whole brewery experience and all the staff involved, how can a brewery utilize not just their brewing staff, but their entire staff to brainstorm new ideas? Should we all come together and just throw out ingredients that we'd like to see in beers that year? Or should we base it along a certain style of beer? Where do you see the brainstorm sessions becoming most valuable?
Yeah, I used to work at Stone and Wood Brewing, not about a couple of hours drive south of here. And when I started there about 3.5, nearly 4 years ago now, the place was really like a beer factory, and there was a lot of staff. There was like 30 brewers, and there's 120 staff in total or something like that. And the place was like a beer factory, and there was people who were brewing but not really knowing why they were doing things and what flavor contributions certain raw materials brought to a beer. And so so myself and Pops, Neil Whitthorn, who's one of the brewing mentors, we started the company home brewing club called the League of Extraordinary Brewers. And what we did was we brought home brewing into this massive multi-million litre a year brewery, and what we did was we sort of we would run a competition, say every 6 weeks. That would give people enough time to have a break, go brew again, and bring their beers back in again. And we would set parameters around each competition. So it wasn't like a homebrew competition, but rather we would say, so for example, the first, competition was, right, this competition, you've got to brew an American style pale ale and you're only allowed to use Cascade hops, right? And so that way we learned something about beer styles and ingredients and what they brought to a beer when they were sort of isolated, and sort of made the feature of a particular beer. And we got a dozen different American style pale ales, and it was a lot of fun. And we would get everyone together at the end of the 6 weeks, and we would all go into the sensory panel as a group, and we would just try all the beers and we'd score them. And I think we set it up that we'd vote first, second, what our personal opinion on first, second, and third. So it was completely subjective, right? And that was a massive success. And so we kept rolling with that idea. And what ended up happening was we started doing things like make a beer using only local ingredients. And so what suddenly happened was all these new beer ideas started popping up. And the head brewer, Keelan Vaughan, he basically started taking these ideas and go, oh, well, here's a place where we can sort of innovate. We can scale them up to our pilot brewery, which is like a 5-barrel pilot brewery, go and try them there, and then actually see if they've got some legs around commercial release. And they're doing lots of seasonal releases now, which is really awesome to see. So probably some of the benefits that staff could get, right? So as part of the League of Extraordinary Brewers, if it was open to everybody in the company, it wasn't just brewers. If we would help and encourage staff to go buy their own home brewing equipment. The brewery actually bought its own Braumeister and fermenters and all that sort of stuff, so that if someone couldn't afford the equipment, they had the ability to be able to go and brew. If you were home brewing, you got all your raw materials for free. So basically, we'd set up a pallet with grain, lots of different specialty grain, and you just make arrangements with the shift on hops, and we'd just log it. It was very, very simple. And so if you were home brewing, you got all your raw materials for free, no matter how much you want it, right? And that just really got people inspired to be able to go and make their own beer. And the only proviso around that was that any beer that you created, any recipe that you created, that intellectual property became the intellectual property of the brewery, so that they could go and use it. So it was a lot of fun.
No, I absolutely love that, because one thing I preach constantly is just education, education, education. And when you can get everybody in your brewery involved in the brewing process, one is teaching some of the people who don't necessarily know about the process. They can explain it better to the guests, and they're learning about ingredients. They're getting more deeper connected to the brewery as a whole. They can tell your story more so, just because they have the skill set to do it. So I actually love that idea you just shared with us, Hendo. I love to see more breweries do that. I think it's a great way to innovate. Now, you mentioned as part of that explanation that, a lot of times you'd say brew an American Pale Ale, use Cascade hops. In the world of beer today, I remember when I first started home brewing a decade ago, you had your basic hops that everybody was using. Now, I unfortunately haven't homebrewed in way too long, but I know when I go look at all the hops that are out there right now, that's kind of multiplied times a billion. What about instead of taking, one of the hops we all know, but looking at ingredients, we might not have experiences with? How do you feel about, just, hey, try these 5 ingredients and see what happens?
Yeah, look, there's so many ways you can, cut and chop it, is that like, each time that we were doing one of these competitions, there would always be, make this style of beer, but there was always be one little rule that would be a little constraint that made it quite challenging. And it was really interesting because, like, when we did the one where we said, all right, make a beer that uses local ingredients, and some people were coming up with like Davidson plums, like native fruits and that sort of thing that are native to the local area. And one guy came up to me and he said, oh, there's these really interesting flowers that grow in the sand dunes, on the beach that smell really lovely. I wonder if they would go really well in a beer. And I said, mate, if you went and did that, let's say we were going to make 100 hectoliters of this beer, we're a brewery that's known for its environmental consciousness. Do you think it's going to look good for the brand if we're just going raping and pillaging flowers from sand dunes at the local beach? He's like, oh, yeah. I went, yeah, that's kind of how we have to think about it. Like, we have to think about the scale up of the beer and whether it's practical,
No, that's a really good point. So, Kyle, what are your thoughts on that? Just kind of like the Iron Brewer approach, where you just find ingredients you're looking to throw in and see what happens.
So my local chapter of the Master Brewers Association they didn't do it this year, but in previous years they had an Iron Brewer competition, and they basically went to all the malt, hops, yeast suppliers and basically just said, what are your innovative, new, interesting products for this next year, or what are products you want to move more of? So they would get a bunch of donated malt and hops, and then there's normally about 15 people that compete in the competition, because much more than that, it's really impossible to drink through all the samples in an afternoon. So everyone gets the same bag of ingredients, and the only thing you can add to it is water. So some of the challenges are Like, for example, they never give you 100% of the pale ale malts that you need. So you have to say, okay, I'm going to use Pilsner malts, and I'm going to use pale ale malt, and I'm going to use Munich. Or like, I wanted to do an alt beer the last time, but they didn't have any Vienna or Munich or any of those middle toasted malts. So I had to toast my own Munich malt in my oven at home. But that mixes the challenge. And then there'd be a couple of oddball ingredients, and you didn't have to use them. But for example, this was one of the first ones that ever did happen. There's a brewery called Soda City here in Ontario, and they have this anise flavored imperial stout that started in this competition from just having weird ingredients,
like star anise.
Yeah, star anise, and it's because that was the oddball ingredient, and they decided, okay, we're going to make a stout because in like 19th century England, they used anise and stouts. And
that's such a good idea of going and toasting your own malt.
Yeah,
I never would have thought of that. That's great.
But
it really is Iron Brewer.
Yeah, but it's, for me, it's a fun competition because it leaves out logistics and shipping and packaging dates and the challenges of production brewing. That's completely gotten rid of. It's basically, no, everyone has the same ingredients. They have the same resources. Just make the best beer you can. And it's very no bullshit competition.
Yeah, I like it.
And then would you brew the best of the beers on the larger scale? Is that typically how you've seen it succeed?
That's kind of just like a private competition. It's not like you don't necessarily have to make the products, but I definitely remember coming across a couple of products, and one year I handed a glass to my boss. I'm like, drink this. And he's like, oh, this is wrong with it. This is wrong with it. This is wrong with it. I don't know if I like it. I'm like, yeah, but it was one of the first times malted oats I had come across because the local malt distributor recently got distribution rights for them. And I just like, yeah, but look at what these things that the oats do. And then ultimately we did make our own like oat brown from it because we like things that the oats contributed, but you're not going to necessarily go out and research all the ingredients that are coming out into the market all the time because there's a dozen new hop varieties that come out every year. And it's really hard to get a pound of them just to try. So working with regional suppliers to help push their product lines, but then also get brewers excited to use those products is very helpful.
Yeah, I think this leads nicely into, with specialty ingredients come a lot of one-off beers. Let's take it from your story just now, Kyle, to actually take it back to the tap room in the brewery where these are actually being brewed professionally. How often do you both believe breweries should be doing these one-offs and just unique, releases for their audiences?
I think it varies from brewery to brewery and what its particular business model is. I would be very hesitant to say you should be doing weekly releases or you should be doing monthly releases. I think the best advice that I could offer is get to know your consumers and find out what they want. More frequency is going to work for some breweries, but not so much for others. And if your consumers aren't demanding frequent, seasonal one-off releases, then it might not be worth going to the effort to create those one-off releases. And on the flip side as well, what can also happen, and I've seen this quite a lot, is where a brewery goes and creates a few one-off or seasonal releases, and they sell really well, and then the whole business model becomes one-off and seasonal releases. And you're just going down this rabbit hole of you're doing all this product development. You try to chase those big sales bumps, when you have the new beer releases come out, and you're trying to do it with such frequency that either your core range suffers or the efficiency of your brewery suffers. And that can be, and coming up with lots of beer ideas and that sort of thing with such frequency can be really exhausting.
Yeah, it sounds pretty.
And so I'd say my advice there to any brewery that's thinking about a seasonal release program is have a plan, and also have a plan and maybe plan 12 months in advance and have 12 months worth of seasonal beers in advance. So at least everybody in the brewery has an expectation of what's happening, so that there's a pilot program that's getting ready to support those beer releases. There's the marketing department, which know they have to create labels and decals and designs and all that sort of stuff, and beer names and that sort of thing. And everybody in the team is sort of working towards that common goal, I think. So it's going to vary, mate.
Yeah, I think scale is probably the largest contributing factor. If you're a little brew pub with a relatively local consumer base, you can probably have more mobility in your beer types. If you're a massive production brewery, well, you have silos and contracts and like resources at your disposal and that are very different from the little brew pub just changing things on the fly. But
momentum.
But it's not like you can't keep trying new things. Like, for example, there was a brewery here in Ontario, and they didn't release very far. They just had a tap called Narcissism of Minor Differences, and it was an IPA. It was just an IPA tap, and they're like, yeah, this is going to be different every time. We just brew this once a month, and we're going to use what hops we've either got left over from other batches or what hops are new or what we've got samples of. And they're like, yeah, it's going to be about 6-7% and it's going to be about 60 IBUs, but we're going to change where the hops are going. And they just flat out told customers, is like, this will never be the same product twice, so don't expect it to be the same product twice.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Or you can do things like a rotating sour series, like your base sour recipe stays the same, and then what changes month to month is the type of fruit you add or the type of specialty ingredient. So you're not changing the recipe too much over the long term. It's, that it's like, okay, I'm going to be adding fruit to the whirlpool. What does that fruit look like? How much is that fruit changing? Where do I source it from? And it's a lot easier to do small tweaks over the long term than completely new beer ideas all the time.
Yeah, that's very common. You see that
just now. You talked a bit about consistency. You talked about just throwing in whatever hops, throwing the kitchen sink to see what happens in the beers. That can go both ways. If your brewery has a reputation for doing these one-offs that are just, super unique, your customers can come and know that's what they expect. But a lot of times when you have someone coming in for the first time, or the first time then coming back the second time because they tried that first beer they loved, only to realize it's a one-off, you can kind of play with your customers' emotions right there. I think there's definitely the balance of knowing your customers, Hendo, as you said earlier, and knowing what type of brewery you are with your ability to put out these one-offs and the frequency that you can do them. But it ultimately comes down to how you're communicating that message to both your customers and your staff. And Hendo, you mentioned, you got to have everyone in the brewery involved, the marketing team, the brewers. It takes so many people to get these beer releases out. And I think communication is extremely vital. You can't just throw it to your marketing staff, say, hey, we need a name tomorrow. There has to be a little bit more planning that goes into these, and having a calendar of your releases and just getting everybody involved in the process. I mean, we talked early in the conversation about just getting staff to help brew recipes, to get them more educated and excited. And, it doesn't have to be just your brewery staff. Everyone involved is hugely important. And now I kind of like to shift the focus to the technical side of things, because I like to say you guys' expertise, but you have so much expertise on anything brewing related. That's why this conversation is so fun today. But with regard to, just the consistency, say you brew one of these one-offs and it is an absolute hit. What type of record keeping do you do to make sure that, hey, while we normally do these as one-offs, this one just came out phenomenal, and how can we do it again and make it become more of a beer we're known for? How do we take it from a one-off to a more larger scale production?
I reckon that, in the product development life cycle, if you are doing sort of pilot brewing and that sort of thing, documenting your recipe as well as your process very early in the game means that you're able to scale it up. I've seen quite a few times where brewers have pilot brewed a really amazing beer, like, somewhere between 20 litres and maybe 100 litres on whatever pilot plant they happen to have at their brewery. And then when they go to scale up to a full commercial size release, then things change. Maybe they might go, oh, we've ran out, we can't get this much fruit, or we can't get these hops, or their process changes, especially with fruit additions, and then attenuation of that sugar that fruit might bring, and alcohol goes out, or the fermentation might get stuck. And what's happened is that brewer has not followed their process from way back at the start when they had something. So, I teach my clients to use a concept called Beer Recipes 2.0, which is like a product specification, which sort of sets out how the beer and the process is going to look in one on one sheet, whether and the way that product specification is written is irrespective of the batch size, right? So nothing is written in kilos or grams or anything like that. It's all done in percentages and ratios, and that way, whether it's a 20-litre batch on the pilot brewery or a 50 hectolitre batch on the big brewery, it's repeatable, and that really helps.
Now, what software do you recommend for helping create these recipes and making sure you can scale them if needed?
Sorry, can you say that again? I missed that.
What software do you recommend using to create these recipes or to scale them if you choose to do so?
Oh, okay. So I have a little bit of a tech stack. So I use Beersmith for recipe formulation. The only things that I really use it for is starting gravity, color, and bitterness. I don't really listen to it particularly much for finishing gravity, and I definitely don't use it for water calculations or anything like that. For water calculations, I use Brew and Water. Martin Brungard's Excel spreadsheet is phenomenal. It's the best $10 a brewer can ever spend. And then I use my own tool, which is the product specifications, or a Beer Recipe 2.0, as I like to call it. And that's actually an Excel spreadsheet, but there's no formulas, there's no calculations. Brewers are really good at writing all these amazing, very complex, bespoke Excel spreadsheets that do all the calculations around efficiency and bitterness and all that sort of stuff. It's an Excel spreadsheet because it's easier to edit cells, and there's no calculations, and you just write the things that you're going to do, and that becomes your plan. So that's what I use when I'm sort of, as far as software goes, when I'm developing products.
And I think it was Adam Savage that has a quote from like Mythbusters when he's like, the difference between fooling around in science is writing things down. Whenever you're developing a recipe, you should treat it like if it's 1 or 100 barrels, treat it the same. Because if you get a winner and you love it and you don't have the notes, you're not going to remember exactly what happened in that beer. And it's really different to be like, you can probably figure out the ingredients again just because everyone has certain preferences, but you're not going to be able to figure out like the idiosyncrasies of that particular batch unless you have the notes to back it up. That's just basic pilot hygiene, where if you know what's going on, then you can figure out what you liked about the beer and what you didn't like about the beer. Like I almost do algebra when I'm brewing. It's like, okay, what do I look at? Alpha acids, and like, is it about the same? Is it different? So you're like, okay, you do it a little bit of math on the fly while you're brewing, but that also helps you make a more consistent product.
Yeah. It's really important that you go through that process of documenting, of pilot brewing and documenting your process, because some other ways that you can play it is you can, like what I like to do is I like to break beers down into what's called high risk and low risk beers. And so basically a low risk beer is a style of beer that I've brewed lots of times before, a lager, a pale ale, an IPA, stout, just things that I can just change up the ingredients. The process largely doesn't change, and I can just jump straight in and go and brew 20 hectoliters, 50 hectoliters, 100 hectoliters, whatever, it's a bit of a no-brainer. And then you switch over into a high-risk beer, and a high-risk beer is basically a beer that uses new ingredients. It might be a fruit, it might be a new hop variety. It might be a yeast strain. That's the most common one where I see it go wrong, where someone decides to use a new yeast strain and not really know it, or a new process. And those high-risk beers need to be pilot brewed, and the process around them needs to be documented, because the last thing that you want to happen is for you to put in this effort or create a high-risk beer, jump straight into commercial size production. Something goes wrong during the production process. You have no plan to deal with it, and you release it, and it's not that great. All right. And so with a little bit of planning and a little bit of forethought, and if you go through this process, and the more people you get involved in the process and documenting everything, you can make sure that whenever you release a brand new beer, that it's an absolute winner and it smells and tastes amazing and the consumers love it.
So we're talking a lot about obviously releasing a high quality product, but how do you determine what is a high quality product? I know that's so subjective, but we talk about involving people. We talking about doing tastings where everybody's taking notes. So we talking about just a brewer and his, assistant brewer trying and say, this is fantastic. What processes do you recommend putting in place for analyzing the beer and just taking notes on it to make sure it meets the standards that you want to take it to the next level?
I think the best thing that one can do, and it's not very difficult to do, is so when I write product specifications and when my clients write their product specifications, they write a true to brand description. So they actually describe what the beer is going to look like, what it's going to smell like, what it's going to taste like, and what the body, mouthfeel, and bitterness is going to be like, and doing it for every beer, right? And then it becomes as simple as making sure you hit that expectation when you go produce the product. And I think that that's just as important as selecting what malt and hops and yeast and that sort of thing you're going to brew with. It's important to actually document the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Sometimes that can be a little bit problematic with some high risk beers if you're using something that's really weird that hasn't really been done before. But on the most part, there's really no reason why you can't write down the sensory outcome that you're trying to achieve. And then it's very easy then, once you've done that, to look back and go, have we achieved that? Yeah, this is pretty much bang on. Or the fruit's a little bit subdued. Okay, we can think about upping the fruit to lift that particular characteristic and that sort of thing. And again, it's about having a plan.
Now, with your high-risk beers, when you put new ingredients in, they're obviously going to have more of a divisive audience. Some people are going to love them. Some people are going to hate them. It's probably a little bit harder to determine if you take one of those beers to the next level. So do you have any recommendations for breweries debating whether to produce larger amounts of some of these more risky beers?
Start small. Start small and do
your homework. Yeah.
And if you look at it more along the lines of trying to figure out how the flavors work together, like I do tons of homework before I come out with a new beer product of any kind, looking at what flavors work together and how to use those ingredients in smart starting ways. For example, one of my favorite reference books is On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee. And the reason why that's one of my favorite references is he actively looks at the active chemical ingredient in food and what that has to give those flavors. So it's like, okay, everyone knows like the hop aromas. Okay, why do we use coriander in some beers? Because they have similar oils that some hops have, and it reminds us of hops sometimes. There's also or fruit flavors. So if you either want to contrast those flavors or you want to build up those flavors. Looking at what similar people have done with similar beers is really helpful. For example, several years ago, I made a Vegemite beer for a friend, and that it doesn't sound great in any way.
Are you just saying that because Hendo's here today? Come on.
Maybe a little bit. So the brew pub was called Lansdowne Brew Pub, and of course we called it Lansdowne Under. And
come on.
But so I looked at the amount of salt that was in Vegemite, and I figured out, okay, how much salt is in a Goza, and I used the Goza recipe to figure out how much Vegemite I should use. And some people loved it. The Australians were like, there's not enough nearly amount of Vegemite in this beer. And a lot of the Canadians were like, there's way too much Vegemite in this beer. But I'm like, you know what? I'm okay with that. You could tell it was there, but it wasn't overpowering. You could finish the pint. Those are important things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Kyle, that puts out an interesting angle that just now, when you try something so weird, just the marketing alone will attract attention. So if you do a Vegemite beer in a small batch size, the marketing alone, I think, is going to bring the demand to, empty that keg pretty quickly. So how do you decide on that level whether or not it's worth doing again? So you might see that the keg gets emptied super quick, but it's definitely going to take more than just seeing how quickly it empties to know the quality of the product, because time is not the only important aspect of that.
I would try to keep it as limited or release as possible. Maybe, like, for example, normally when I do, well, I haven't done a product like that in several years, but there's normally like a feedback period. If you get customers asking for that specific weird product, there may be a demand, depending how big it is and how easy it is to do. For example, with that Vegemite beer, I had 2 or 3 bars being like, are there any more kegs of this? I'm like, really? Like, this is the beer that you want on tap? I'm like, well, no, I made 1 keg of it. Maybe it's worthwhile to rebrew again. But if you do something and then the phone stays quiet, it might not be worthwhile, but it depends on how far you distribute it and how, like, if it's just in your tap room, it's going to be pretty easy to figure out. Like, if the keg takes 6 months to drain, then you're probably not going to want to rebrew that beer. But if it's gone in a week or 2, then yeah, it might be worthwhile to try again.
There's a formula that I like to use there. Sorry, Andrew. There's a formula I like to use there where if you've got a seasonal release beer and let's say it's a high risk beer that might be very polarizing, the formula that I like to use is always undersupply the market by 20% of the demand. Right? This doesn't apply to flagship beers and year round, obviously, but with seasonal beers, always aim to undersupply the market by 20%. Make sure that some people miss out on getting it the first time around, because when it does come back, that'll generate demand from those people who did like the beer and want to try it again. It also gets those consumers who missed out the first time to re-engage and try the beer for their first time. And it also prevents you from oversupplying, because you just don't know how popular, how much a beer is going to get traction, right? And the last thing you want to do is, as Kyle said, is wind up with a beer where the kegs are just sitting around, taking up a tap on the bar for months and months and months and not pulling through. So intentionally undersupplying the market by 20% ensures that you're pulling through what you got. And if you have the ability, you can just scale up production progressively and do it at a much lower financial risk as well.
And I always like to tie things together and just minding the comments. Earlier, Ashton mentioned Cigar City Brewing is doing pretty cool, innovative things. And, that kind of comes full circle in my life right now, because I just finished listening to the Beer Edge podcast, which is a fantastic, podcast these days. And they're doing an interview 2-parter with one of the founders of Cigar City, and they're talking about Hunahpu, their really unique stout they put out once a year, and it's turned into a complete event, as many of you guys know. But there's so many factors to consider. When they first did it, they had no idea what would become of it. So there's the risk. Then you got to talk about how much did you brew? What can you do with it? And while it's turned into a massive event production for them, there's also the stress that comes with it. There's so many things you have to factor in, not just the recipes of the beer. And there's so many people involved to make something like Hunahpu Day such a success. So, while these one-offs can have so much value, there's just so much considerations that should be taken into effect. And highly recommend listening.
I think Dark Lord Day is probably the most famous one-off release period, because Three Floyds would literally release it once a year. You could only get 2 bottles. You could buy previous year's bottles if they had any left over from previous years. But they made a huge, they're not celebrating it that way in this with COVID, but they made it a weekend event. And I know people that traveled long and hard for music festival and a beer release, because it just spoke to those customers well enough that they were willing to go across borders just for that experience.
Or Russian River doing Plenty the Younger Day, where they just have massive queues around the brew pub in Santa Rosa. It's just phenomenal, And again, it takes, for beers like Dark Lord, Pliny the Younger, or Hunopu. It takes time to build up that momentum, right? So don't be going out there and just flooding the market with this beer because it sells great once, right? Take it away, right? Make people wait for it, and then bring it back again and make a big deal out of it. And one of your beers will eventually stick and become a massive thing that turns into maybe something like that.
And I think that's a fantastic point there. There's a brewery that I've interacted with, and they wanted to release a beer on that level, but the problem was they planned this beer to be on that level. The beer didn't work its way up to that level. So when they tried to create a day specifically around this unique beer, it didn't have the hype they wanted because it wasn't organic. They literally just tried to manufacture hype, which is not necessarily a key for success by any means. I think exactly. Your most successful beers are going to become successful because people start to talk about them, not because you put it in a consumer's face typically and say, hey, this is going to be our number one bestseller. It doesn't necessarily work that way.
Oh, absolutely. I can't imagine, like, if you try to create a day out of a brand new beer and that brand new beer happens to suck, oh man, that can be really problematic.
But on the other side of the table, I think it's a good idea to pair seasonal releases with, events. You can pair, a holiday ale, something, perfect to drink during the colder months. I know, Hendo, it's not quite cold where you're at right now, so I don't think you're sipping on as many Russian Imperials as I am, but it's nice to pair things with the setting that they belong with. Now, I want to kind of dive out. Julie put in the comments right now, Julie Rose asked this question kind of going back to, just overall communication in the brewery. I love to hear you guys' thoughts on the time necessary to properly launch one of these one-off beers, because she's mentioned that there's often a disconnect between the sales and production side. What type of timeline do you both believe is necessary to provide everyone involved with the education needed to properly promote a beer?
I reckon that in relation to Julie's question there, like having a big disconnect between the production and the business side of things, if she's experiencing that problem, that's a sign of either a lack of communication or a lack of a plan within the brewery. And you need to have a chat about, beer. You need to spitball some beer ideas and some beer names and some beer labels and designs, on a regular basis. And because brewers love creating new beers, right? And they just want to go and create something awesome. And sometimes that gets to the marketing department or the sales department's going to go, what the hell? We can't sell that. And you just need to have some dialogue and a conversation about, what you're trying to achieve and what outcomes you think you're going to get with the beer. And again, coming back to these beer recipes 2.0 is writing down what the beer is going to look like and smell like and taste like. And actually if a brewer really wants to show their mettle, is to actually put in front of the marketing department the sensory description of the beer. This is the beer that I'm going to create. Let's not talk about the ingredients in it or anything like that yet, but let's talk about this is the beer that we want to create. Because if you isolate that from how it's made or what ingredients are in it from, say, the marketing department, then that's going to get them intrigued, right? And then you sort of start to bring in what flavors, what ingredients come into it, after you've spoken about flavors. And then that becomes more of a collaborative thing, It has to be collaboration between the marketing department and the production floor. Because like if you have a brewer who just goes off on his own, goes lone wolf and goes and makes this beer, doesn't communicate to the marketing department about his or her intentions, how can the marketing department back that and sell it, right? And bring some good to the business.
Speaking my language on that one.
And then on the flip side, if the marketing department comes up with a beer idea, and they sometimes do, where they come up with a beer idea and the brewer is going to go, that's a terrible idea. That happens as well.
Vegemite in the beer.
Yeah.
I'm all for that. And so the thing is, right, is that if it comes the other way, right, is that if the marketing department says, hey, let's make this type of beer, and then the brewer goes, that's a dumb idea. We're not doing that. it's just a sign of a lack of dialogue and communication. It's okay to disagree on beer ideas and that sort of thing, but you've got to talk and you've got to find some consensus, and there's got to be a meeting of the minds. Because at the end of the day, when you choose to pull the trigger and go and brew a commercial size batch of this seasonal release, everyone's got to be on board. Yeah. Everybody's got to be on board. The brewers have to be passionate about the beer. The marketing department has to be excited for the release. So they're out pre-selling it, and taking orders. And then when it hits, hits the market, that everyone's just really loud about it, and all the different staff are posting on social media about how awesome this beer is and that sort of thing. And getting the marketing department involved in the actual product development is a really good idea. If they're kept in the dark and they don't know, then they don't understand, and it's difficult for them to back that really awesome idea that the brewer might have.
And with your beer profile idea, what I would say is immediately start working on a target drinker profile. So you're like, I am developing this product, because if you say, I'm just going to make a beer for beer drinkers, I've said this in several talks before, you're not going to be able to connect with your customer. If you just say, I'm making Joe's Lager because we are Joe's Lager Brewing Company, most people won't pay attention. And it's really and the people who might not necessarily might want that generic lager, it's going to be a hard shift to break them from their consistent buying patterns. But if you say, okay, I want to make this type of IPA and I'm going to try to sell it to this consumer, then that's getting both the brewers and the marketing departments working in the same direction. Where if you just say, okay, brewers, come up with a beer name. Like when I was production brewing, I would say, okay, who are we trying to sell this beer to? And they'd be like, beer drinkers. I'm like, well, I don't know where to start then. That's not helpful. There's 12 million people in Ontario. That's not a target market at all. That's so large of a net that you're never going to capture the people that are going to be really passionate about that product either. Are
you saying find your niche, mate?
Yeah, finding a niche for the product, but also your different products are going to have different types of consumers. Your easy, safe drinking Kolsch is going to have a different type of target consumer than your triple IPA. But you still have those same products in the same general portfolio. It's just they're going to have different people drinking them.
And I think you need to understand your individual target market as well, even more so than just the overall market. You need to know who's coming into your tap room. If the people coming into your tap room are just looking for a nice lager to drink after work, they might not want your craziest double dry hopped IPA that you're trying to experiment. It might just kind of go and not be as fresh as you like over time. So I really think, you need to dial down and actually know the customers sitting at your bar, not just the general drinker profile in Toronto, for example.
It also really helps your sales staff because over the course of my decade in brewing, I've seen going from a couple of core products to up to 12, 24 sometimes, which I think is absurd. But if your sales staff is walking into a client or meeting up with a client and they say, okay, what do you have for me? We're going to drink 24 beers today. They'll be like, get out of here. Come on. I don't have time to drink 24 beers. I'll be sloshed. But if you say, hey, we're going to but if you go into a sports bar and you say, oh, we're going to try the light lager, the lager, and the cream ale, then that customer is much more willing to make that time for you. But if you try to sell your Imperial Stout to, the Hot Wings place, it's going to be a tough sell.
Very, very true. Now, as we hit that hour mark, gentlemen, we talked a lot about just getting involved with your community, not just your, local community, but your community who works inside your brewery, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with regard to communication. We've talked a lot about consistency today. If you had to give one takeaway to anyone, whether on the brewing side of the operation or the marketing side of the operation, what is the one thing you'd like to have resonate with them?
Do you mean within a brewery, as in advice for a brewery, or?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's very simple. If I could give one word of advice, collaborate.
Give me more than one word.
Yeah, that's it. Collaborate. That's what it is. It's creating a one-off or seasonal beer release program is extraordinarily challenging, and it's difficult for just one person to do it. And it doesn't matter if you're a brew pub or you're a big production brewery or something like that. It's very challenging to get all of the cogs in the machine working together to make sure that that beer release is A, really, really good and consumers love it, and B, sells well, you know, and they're the two things you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. And that takes a team effort. And so that's kind of how I would the advice that I would give for a brewery to approach seasonal beer releases is start to make product development and pilot brewing part of just what you do on a day-to-day basis. And then it becomes collaborative. And that's what we were doing. So like in the company homebrew club at Stone and Wood was like literally the first beer that we made off that 20-litre Braumeister system was a 20-litre version of their flagship beer, which was Pacific Ale, right? And there's a bar in the staff room and that sort of thing where you can have a beer after your shift and that sort of thing. And that 20-litre keg was gone in 20 minutes, half an hour, you know, because there's something special about this, you know, this person made this special 20-litre batch of the flagship beer, or whether it's like, oh, this person made this 20-litre batch of this really creative beer. It brings out that handmade kind of thing, and it's kind of special. And if everyone gets on board with it, then the marketing department, for instance, can try this pilot batch of the beer, go, hey, I really like that, you know, or there's something in that. And then they become involved and inspired and that sort of thing. And then you wind up with this massive collaborative process. So collaboration is my advice.
I really love it. And Kyle, on to you. Words of wisdom.
Figure out the process that you want. Figure out your map or your process or your roadmap or whatever word you want to call it. I've chatted a lot about this topic in the last 6-8 months. Just figure out the steps you want to establish as a brewery to get to your end product. So if you have that roadmap and you have those steps involved, it's going to help establish what you can and can't make. So for example, if you just say, oh, we have to be able to use our current lauter ton for whatever reason, then you know that a 60% rye beer is not going to work in it just because your brewer will be there for 2 days lautering. So figuring out the roadmap that you want to take to develop these new products. And if it's okay, yeah, we do our little League of Extraordinary Brewers for the ideas. That's a step in the roadmap. The next step is, okay, we serve it in the tap room for a couple of months, see if it has traction. That's the next step in the roadmap. If you don't, but if a product fails or doesn't do well, you're not investing a whole lot of I've seen it happen time and time again where if you don't have that system in place, you just say, okay, we're going to make this big beer. If it wasn't launched at the right time, if it didn't have enough product support, if it didn't have the right branding, it's just going to wither and die. And unfortunately, a lot of great products, if they don't have the secondary support through just having the company-wide execution plan, you're just going to have like the graveyard of bad beers. But were they good beers, or were they I remember someone telling me that they're like, oh, it's like 5 years ago we didn't have any IPAs and now we have 4 or 5. And I looked at their portfolio. I'm like, no, you had 4 or 5 IPAs back then. They did well in competition, but the branding wasn't on point. So figuring out the whole generic plan, like the steps as a company, is really important so that you don't get your brewers coming up with a great beer or your marketers coming up with a great branding message and then it not coming together and then it ultimately failing. So figuring out the steps, the process, the roadmap, and each step of the way makes it a huge, huge help for figuring out whether or not you should keep products in your portfolio or if they need help.
That's fantastic advice there. I mean, at the end of the day, it's been a weird year for everyone here in 2020. We have to keep our customers interested no matter what you're brewing, whether one-offs or your flagship. You have to find ways to keep your customers engaged. You need to keep your staff positive. You need to keep everybody engaged. And the processes you two have spoken about today has been really valuable to learn about for me and for everyone watching today. So I thank you both for joining me today. It's always fun to hang out. Yeah. Kyle, enjoy your day. And Steve, or Hendo, I apologize. I don't get to say this too often, but sweet dreams. And I hope to talk to you both very soon. So thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.